Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 12, which covers the idea of negative externalities. So, in order to succeed in this chapter, please make sure that you're watching this posted video, taking notes on the posted lecture slides, and also reading chapter 12 from our textbook. We've had a few weeks without textbook readings, now our readings are back, so please make sure that you keep up with those as well. Alright, so first what we're going to do today is I want to start out with a question before we get into the outline that I have here. So my question for you is, what is the optimal level of pollution? Now, I know this sounds like a funny question because we might think, the ideal level of pollution is to have none, right? If pollution is harmful to us and to the environment, why don't we try to get rid of it completely? So maybe your answer is 0, but it's very difficult for us to achieve zero pollution, right? It might be easy for us to greatly reduce the level of pollution that we emit, maybe trying to avoid the most pollutive activities. So not burning coal, maybe not driving your personal vehicle, choosing to bike or walk or take public transportation instead, not spraying harmful chemicals into the environment that damage the ozone, things like that. But there's some pollution that's really hard for us to reduce, right? It's hard for us to get all the way down to 0 because even with clean energy, driving electric vehicles, things like that, there's still going to be a little bit of pollution. So it's very, very costly for us to try and reduce our pollution all the way down to 0. And so what any society is trying to do is we're trying to balance the benefits of pollution abatement or of pollution reduction with the costs of actually reducing that pollution. All right, let's get started by first talking about what an externality or a negative externality is. So an externality is just an unintended side effect or an unintended consequence of some market activity. So if I'm participating in a market as a buyer or a seller, but my behavior has some unintended side effect on a third party, that means that I am generating an externality. So a negative externality is when this unintended side effect is a cost or some kind of harm. So a negative externality imposes some unintended cost on a third party, on someone who's not directly participating in this market or in this activity. And so an externality is a type of market failure. And we say that a market failure has occurred anytime there is an inefficiency in our market. So if we have something happening in our market that pulls us away from that efficient outcome where our total surplus is maximized, then we'd say that we have a market failure. So taxes also generate a market failure. Price ceilings or price floors, if they're binding, also generate a market failure. And so an externality is just another type of market failure. So now that we know a negative externality is just some unintended cost that's imposed on a third party due to some market activity, let's break down the different types of costs that are generated by any market activity. So first we have internal costs, and these are kind of the unavoidable costs or maybe the costs that aren't necessarily a bad thing. So internal costs are the costs of a market activity that are paid only by the participants in that market. So these are the costs that are paid by the people who are choosing to participate in this activity. Next, we have external costs, and these are the ones that can be problematic if we're dealing with a negative externality. So external costs are the costs of a market activity that are imposed on the people who are not actually participating in that market. This is our innocent bystander, our third party, that is experiencing some cost that they didn't sign up to pay for. Lastly, we have social costs, and this is just the sum of our internal and our external costs from said market activity that we're talking about. All right, now let's talk about how we can correct for a negative externality in the market. So when a negative externality is present, the social cost is greater than the internal cost. What this means is that too much of this good is being produced from society's perspective. And this is because individuals or individual suppliers, like me with my pollutive factory, are only considering the internal costs and benefits of our decisions when we decide whether or not to do something. So I'm not concerned about the costs that I'm imposing on society when I choose to operate my dirty factory. So in the absence of any sort of government intervention or regulation, individuals are going to choose to operate at their, personal optimal quantity. I'm going to continue to produce from my polluted factory, and I'm not going to consider at all the harmful pollution that I'm imposing onto others. So in order to get away from this and achieve the social optimum, we need some kind of regulation. We need to force this party to internalize the externality. We want to make me, with my dirty factory, pay for the social cost. So let's use this graph of the market as an example. So I am the supplier in this situation, and I am only considering my internal costs. When I do this, the market is going to operate at the market equilibrium EM. We have our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price. But the social cost to produce is higher than my internal cost to produce. So what this means is that if I start to consider the social cost, this increases the cost for me to produce my product, and we know from the supply and demand chapter that increased costs to produce are going to shift my supply curve to the left. So if some regulation forces me to observe the social cost or the external cost of my production with pollution, my supply curve is going to shift to the left. This brings us to a new equilibrium, which is our social optimum. So this is the price and quantity of my good that should be produced if I consider the costs that I'm imposing on society, on that third party. So society would rather that I produce less of this product, and as a result, the equilibrium price will also be higher at my social optimum. And so what's really happening here is by forcing this internal party to consider the cost to society, we're eliminating the deadweight loss, or we're eliminating that market failure or inefficiency. And so on this graph, this triangle here actually represents the deadweight loss that was occurring before I was forced to consider the social cost. Once my supply curve shifts upward and I reduce my production, this deadweight loss is eliminated and our market is happy operating at this social optimum. So how can we actually get this to happen? How can we get this responsible party to internalize the externality, consider the social costs, and adjust their behavior? If we're talking about production like this, where I have some polluted factory, the first thing we can do is we could tax production. So by implementing a tax on producers, we could get the supply curve to shift upwards like this. The government could also regulate production and maybe limit me in my production so that I can only produce this optimal quantity. I can't produce any more than that. Or the government could encourage some kind of research and development to help me create a cleaner factory. Maybe they can encourage researchers to find some new technology that will allow me to produce my product without generating so much pollution. So there's many different ways that we can go about this, and different people will argue that different solutions are more effective. Oftentimes, negative externalities occur because we have a lack of clearly defined property rights. And so what property rights do is they give the owner of some resource complete control over that resource. And so this is why with something like air pollution, we easily have negative externalities. There's no clearly defined property rights over all of the air on Earth, right? It's something that we all use and we all use it freely. So there is no single party that owns all of the air on Earth. And so because of this, I might feel like I have the right to pollute the air with my factory, but of course everybody else feels like they have the right to breathe clean air. So this is where we have this friction or this tension. All right, so property rights are giving the owner the ability to exercise control over their resource. And if we have private property, then this is the exclusive right of ownership that allows for the use of and the exchange of property. And so having clearly defined property rights and private property can help us to reduce negative externalities. And this is because property rights incentivize people to maintain their property, to protect it, to conserve their resources, and to trade with others. So let's think about private property in the context of a car. If you own your own car, you have the incentive to maintain it, right? You want your car to be running and in good condition for a long time, so you're going to perform routine maintenance so that your car will last. You might also be incentivized to maintain your car because a car that's kept in good condition is going to be worth more if you try to sell it than if you treat your car like a piece of crap and you let it fall into disrepair. Next, property rights create the incentive to protect what you own. So again, if you own a car, you're going to be incentivized to lock it, or maybe to get a dash cam, or to put your car alarm on, or a wheel lock. You want to protect your property from theft or damage because you are the one who gets to use and exchange this property if you choose to do so. Private property also creates this incentive to conserve. So with your personal vehicle, maybe you're not going to just drive it around willy-nilly until it dies. You want to conserve it so that you can use it when you want to. And lastly, property rights create the incentive to trade with others. So because you are the one who owns your car and you get to decide whether you're going to sell it in exchange for money, you're the sole benefactor of that trade, right? So if somebody tells you that they'll buy your car for $5,000 and that's a good price to you, then you're going to accept that deal. All right, so with clearly defined property rights, it becomes much easier for the responsible party to internalize the negative externality and get us back to that social optimum. To see how this works, we're going to talk about something called the Coase Theorem, which is a very famous theorem in economics that shows us how two parties can work together to internalize an externality and resolve any kind of dispute. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to imagine that we have two farmers that are living on adjacent pieces of land, and there's no fence between their properties. So one of these farmers is raising cattle, and the other farmer is growing wheat. And so you might already see the problem here. One farmer has a bunch of cows, the other farmer has a big wheat field, but there's no fence between their properties. So what this means is that sometimes the cows from this farmer wander onto the wheat field, and they eat the wheat that the other farmer is growing. So these cows are harming the wheat farmer, right? They're eating some of his crops and maybe cutting into some of his profits. So the cow farmer is generating a negative externality. He's only considering his internal costs and benefits when he decides to raise cattle, but he's imposing an external cost on his neighbor when his cows wander over and eat some of that wheat. So there's two options here for what can happen, depending on who has property rights in this situation. So first, we'll talk about the first scenario, and the first scenario is where the wheat farmer has the right to a pristine field. So in scenario one, the cattle rancher is going to be responsible for paying damages to the wheat farmer when his cows eat the wheat. And so the cattle rancher can, remedy this situation when he's responsible in one of two ways. He could put up a fence to divide the two properties, or he could just pay damages to the wheat farmer. So the cattle farmer might choose to put up a fence, that way his cows can't get over onto the wheat field and eat the wheat, or he'll just choose to give the wheat farmer some cash payment that says, hey, I'm sorry that my cows ate your wheat. Here is the money that you would have earned if you were able to sell the wheat that my cows ate. So those are the two options for our cattle farmer. And what he's going to do is he's going to choose the option that is the cheapest for him. If it's cheaper for him to build a fence, he's going to build a fence. So maybe if his cows eat a whole bunch of wheat, it's cheaper to just build the fence and keep them out. If his cows are not eating a whole lot of wheat, maybe they're just eating a little piece here and there, and it's cheaper for him to just pay damages directly to the farmer, that's what he's going to do. So if the fence is more expensive, he'll just pay damages directly to the farmer. So that's our first scenario. The wheat farmer is entitled to having a undamaged, pristine field, so the cattle rancher has to make the situation right, has to internalize that external cost that he's imposing on the wheat farmer. Our other scenario is the opposite, where our wheat farmer does not have the legal right to a cattle-free field. And so in this case, now our wheat farmer is responsible for remedying the situation. So the wheat farmer faces the same choice. He can either put up a fence, so he can protect his property from the cows, or he can just live with the damage. These are the two options for our wheat farmer if he's responsible for his own field. And so he's going to do whichever one is cheaper. Again, if it's cheaper for him to put up the fence than to accept the damage, he's going to put up the fence. This is the result of our Coase Theorem. If our two parties are able to negotiate freely and easily, and their property rights are fully specified, then the responsible party is going to be willing to negotiate to internalize the externality. If the cattle farmer is responsible for the damages that his cows do, he's going to choose to build the fence or pay the farmer directly for damages to the wheat field. If the wheat farmer is responsible, then he's going to choose to build the fence or just live with the damages caused by the cows. So we can apply this idea of the Coase Theorem to my example where we're all living in the same town. I have a factory that's very pollutive, and that's imposing some negative externality in the form of pollution on everyone else living in the town. So if those living in the town have the rights to clean air, then I am going to need to find some way to clean up my pollution and internalize that externality. So maybe I reduce my production, I get some new technology that allows me to produce my product more cleanly. If I can't find some way to reduce my externality, then I will just have to pay out the residents of the town directly for the damages that I'm doing to them in the form of pollution. If, on the other hand, I have the right to pollute, then, this is maybe a kind of backwards way of thinking, or a funny example, but if I have the right to pollute the air in the town, then all of the residents of the city are just going to have to accept my pollution, or they are going to have to implement the tech in order to reduce pollution. And so clearly, when we have an example like this, where we have one individual that is polluting or creating the negative externality, and a very large group of people that are being harmed by that behavior, it might be hard for that very large party to organize together to negotiate, right? So in this situation, this is where we might need some government regulation. It might be very difficult for all the residents of the town to organize and tell me that I can't pollute the air. And so instead, the government might step in and impose some kind of environmental regulation. And this is what we typically see in the real world. So there's some different ways that the government might impose environmental regulation. One method is something that we call command and control, where the government sets limits on the amount of pollution that each business can create. So we can imagine that I have my dirty polluted factory in our town, but there's other producers all around the country that are producing the same product and polluting just as much. So the government steps in and they say, hey, each factory can only pollute this amount. And then with this regulation, they're reducing the total amount of pollution. So now each factory can only pollute so much, and we have across the board reduced pollution. The thing about this command and control regulation, though, is that economists might argue that it's not the most efficient way to reduce pollution. Between my factory and all the other factories around the world, it might be easier for some of us to reduce pollution than it is for others, maybe based on our inputs, on the location, on our other costs. Some factories might be able to reduce their pollution by a lot, while for some factories they can only reduce their pollution by a little. And so this is why economists might argue for another type of environmental regulation called cap and trade. And so what happens under cap and trade environmental regulation is the government issues permits to each producer, and they say this permit is going to allow you to pollute X amount into the air. So they cap the amount of pollution with these permits, but they allow these factories to trade permits with one another. So for example, if it's really easy for me to reduce my pollution by a lot, then I could take my permit that allows me to pollute a lot, and I could sell it to a factory that has a harder time reducing their pollution. And so we're still going to have the same reduction in pollution across the board, because we've capped it by handing out all these permits, but we're allowing these factories to reallocate that pollution in terms of what is most efficient. And so economists will argue that this cap and trade regulation might give us a better outcome.